Hey folks, David Stewart here. Very important decision came down the pipe from the Supreme Court. Of course, it was a 5-4 decision, as they seemingly always are these days. The decision comes down to this. You can no longer compel employees to pay union dues as a condition of employment. So the end of the closed shop is what we're looking at, where you have to join the union, or you have to at least pay the union dues, even if you don't sign on the line and say you're part of the union, in order to work in a shop, in order to work in a particular place of employment. This is big for public sector employees because almost all of them are unionized, and unions have been on the decline in the private sector for a bunch of reasons I don't need to go into in this video. Now, I think this is actually a great decision. I'm really, really happy about it. And as I say that, people are going to think that I'm super anti-union. And I promise you I am not anti-union. What I am anti is bad unions, and I'm also anti-involuntary unions, and those are almost always the exact same thing. I'd like to give you a little bit of my experience and some of the breakdown with that about why this decision matters, why it's the right decision, and why invoking the First Amendment for this decision is relevant and is important. Now, I've been a member of several unions over the course of my life. I was a member of a union when I was a farm laborer, and I've been a member of, I think, 3 or 4 different unions as a teacher in various places and at various levels. And most recently, I was a dues-paying member. I refused to sign on the line and say I was a member of the CTA, but I was a member of the CTA and a local union that was affiliated with the CTA, and that's the way they tend to organize things. There's a local chapter, and then there's the big CTA. Now, the CTA is essentially a giant monopolistic corporation. It controls the vast majority of schools in the state of California. It's one of the biggest public sector unions that exists, and it's like right here in California. They collected from me about $1,000 a year. I don't have the exact money in front of me, but it adds up to about $1,000. Out of that $1,000, by their own admission, and they have to disclose this according to law, 9/10 of the money that they collected, they didn't spend on anything related to union activities, meaning collective bargaining. In fact, I never saw them do any collective bargaining while I've been working. I've never really seen it. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it certainly didn't happen at any location I've worked at. So no money on collective bargaining, or certainly no money protecting employees from exploitation by like the employer or things like that. 9/10 of it was spent on politics and political speech, and that's really, to me, where the First Amendment comes into play. So out of $1,000, a small amount of it, like $35, went to my local union, the people that I know, the union rep. I know the people in the union. Those are the people who are the first ones facing the administration. They get like $35 a year from each employee, which is almost nothing. Then the rest of it goes off to the CTA, and it never really comes back. So 9/10 of what goes to the CTA gets spent on political action committees, direct advertising, or is given to candidates. And I think with like 97%, some huge percentage, like a couple Republicans got some money, but they were almost always Democrats, which means they're taking money by force and giving it to a political party, which means that it's essentially limiting your ability to use that money for your own political speech or to give it to a political candidate. They're using it on advertising, which means they're speaking politically after taking your money and using it involuntarily. And in general, it's a little bit of a violation of a contract, because you have a contract with you and the employer, and having a third party enter into it and decide how much money they get to gather up from you isn't really part of any kind of mutually voluntary contract. But the big one that I think they ruled on is the fact that these unions, they do spend money on political action. And they do spend money by advertising and engaging in political speech against the will of their members. And that's a big one that got me. So most of the money gets funneled from the taxpayers to employees at schools, which is then funneled to the Democratic Party. So in essence, they get $800 a year for every teacher gets given to the Democratic Party and taken out of the pockets of taxpayers, which I consider a very, very bad thing. Now, there's a lot of people who are opposed to this ruling because they say that there's going to be a bunch of freeloaders, and they cite some statistics like 760,000 employees will choose not to pay union dues if they have a choice. Now, what that number means to me, or any kind of statistic like that, means that if employees are not wanting to pay union dues, it's because they're not getting any value out of it. The things that you generally don't want to pay for are things that you don't get value from. So if people had the option to not pay for water, they would still want water. So if it was like, hey, if you don't pay for water, you get no water, it's like, well, I'd like water, so I'll pay for water. If it's like, you don't pay for the union, you get no union, it's like, I don't want to pay for the union because the union doesn't do anything for me. And I've had a lot of personal experiences where friends of mine had very, very big conflicts that had to do with contracts, like the collectively bargained contract that an administrator or part of the administration was willfully breaking, and the union didn't support them on it. So I've seen the situations where it's like your job in between these collective bargaining things where they don't tend to do anything. Your job is to protect the employee, and you don't really do that. So it's like virtually zero value going to the employee when they're paying for a union to do any kind of collective bargaining activity or employee protection or things like that. That's a big deal, and that should concern anyone. So as soon as you allow the employee to essentially fire the union to say, we're going to withhold our money unless we're getting value, because a union is not just a monopoly in a given location, it's an enforced monopoly. You don't have an option except to pay for the union. It's not like a cable company monopoly, right? If there's a cable company and they have a monopoly in your neighborhood, you don't have to have cable. You could always like watch TV on an antenna or do something else for internet. You don't have to have cable. But if you're working as a teacher, you have to pay the union. It is not an option for you. So it's the worst kind of monopoly. And as a result, you see the worst kind of stewardship of that particular set of money that they get. Now, I mentioned that there was a fallacy in saying that, like, out of $1,000, $900 is spent on political action, or $800 is spent on political action. The fallacy there is that there's no separate costs for a joint product. The union is a joint product that produces things that they do for teachers in the CTA and a bunch of political action that goes together. So you can't say that you're not supporting the political speech of the union if you have to pay the union anything, because it continues to exist as a political entity making political speech and pooling all the money together. Even if every employee was somehow able to restrict the amount of money that the union spent for political action, there'd probably still be political action happening, which would still violate the First Amendment there. Now, there's lots of complaints about freeloaders. Freeloaders are the thing that you can have. It's like, if they have an option not to pay, then you're going to have people freeloading on this kind of thing. Well, if that's the case, then the union stops representing them, and either the employees get hosed during collective bargaining, or they hire a firm to collectively bargain for them and manage those particular affairs. So they hire the union to do the contract negotiation and manage strikes if they have to, fight for particular things that the employees want, or they organize their own union, which could be free. If you're organizing it yourself in your own workplace, there may be no dues required because you're just all meeting on your own time and deciding that for yourself. No union required. Or you just pay a lawyer. You get enough money to pay one contract lawyer to deal with, who's a specialist in that, to deal with the contract negotiation. That is, to me, a big plus for workers, not a negative for workers. And then other people are going to say, well, the workers only have these rights because the unions are out there spending this political money. That's nonsense at this point in time. Most of what the union does to protect employees has essentially been made superfluous by things like OSHA and other kinds of government regulations, as well as tort law. If an employee is harmed in the course of work, they can sue their employer. Tort law is a big thing here in the United States, and tort law is highly flexible. And tort law only costs money when somebody does something wrong. If you're paying a union and nobody's doing anything wrong, then it's like you're just giving money to somebody for no reason. Whereas tort law, only the violators have to pay the money. And that's when the money ends up coming, is when you actually achieve victory in a case. So it's an interesting thing to think about with this particular ruling. I think it's a really good thing. I think it'll actually improve worker relationships with employers and improve their ability to bargain. Now, a couple of other things I'll say is I want to talk briefly about the teaching experience and what this has to do, what the unions have to do with the teaching experience. You have a lot of lies that surround teaching, that surround the job, that surround the pay rate and things like that. Here in California, most beginning teacher salaries tend to start at around $50,000. Some start less. One of the things you'll notice is that there's a salary schedule at these places that the union helps negotiate. The salary schedule tends to favor older teachers, not younger teachers. So the longer you've worked, the higher your pay rate is, and the more post-baccalaureate education units have, the higher your pay rate is. But those tend to happen really automatically as you get older, because you get all kinds of continuing education opportunities that are paid for you. So really, if you look at it, you end up kind of, from your perspective, moving diagonal. You move diagonal through the pay scale till the last district I worked for paid $100,000 a year to teachers who'd been there over 20 years and who were all the way on the right as far as their units. Of course, I'm always on as far as you can go to the right because of the amount of post-baccalaureate units I have. But you have them selecting the saying like, oh, this beginning teachers only make $42,000 a year. It's like, that's if you have no post-baccalaureate units, which every teacher with a credential has at least enough to move over one step. And then most of the teachers are getting paid in excess of $80,000 if they've been there a long time. The salary tends to be pretty high. Now, the other thing about union dues, those $1,000 union dues, is that union dues are not a percentage the way taxes are. So union dues are a set amount. It's $1,000. So $1,000 to a beginning teacher who's making, maybe they're just like fresh out of school on an internship. They're making like $40,000 a year, which is actually okay if you're a single person living by yourself. But they're making $40,000 a year. That $1,000 of union dues is a lot of money compared to somebody who's making $100,000 a year. It's only 1% of their income, but it's more than 2%. It's more than double for the beginning teacher. So union dues tend to come out regressively. They tend to be a type of regressive tax that penalizes new workers and benefits older workers. And most of the negotiations are set up to benefit older workers who tend to be fewer in number, so you can entice more people in with a higher ending salary. It's an interesting thing to think about. So I wanted to give you all of that information to talk about this particular decision, and to say that I actually think this will improve a lot of things about individuals' ability to work in whatever profession they want to without having to be part of a union. If you want to be a public school teacher in California, you really have to be a part of a union. There's no option. Whereas that's not the case in every other profession. You could be an auto mechanic and work in a non-union shop. You could even be a farm laborer and work non-union jobs, as many do. The UFW isn't like a universal organization. But in teaching, it's almost impossible to avoid it unless you're going to a private school, in which case, there's a whole different set of things there. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and thanks for listening to me talk about this. Give me your impressions about this particular decision down below and what you think about it. Do you think it'll be good for workers? Do you think it'll harm unions? I think it'll make unions better at the job that they're supposed to do, which is negotiating collective bargaining rights or negotiating collective bargaining agreements for the workers for the things that they need collectively bargained for, like break times, good bathrooms, good benefits, all those sorts of things. I'm in favor of workers being able to organize, but that's rarely the case with a closed shop union. In most cases, the workers are unionized against their wishes and with no ability to get rid of the union. And that's one last thing I'll say, is that if you had 80% of the people who wanted to get rid of the union, it's still not really going away. Okay, so have a good one, and I'll see you guys next time.